Hello, everyone. I see in the chat that there are so many familiar names, but also new names and lots of different locations. And so we're so glad you all could make it. I know we are all in different time zones, so it's probably has been a little late for some of you. I know one of our speakers for next week, Pedro, is here, and Pedro's told me that he'd be having lots of coffee. So Pedro, I hope you have your cup in place. So welcome everyone. Welcome to Material Histories of the Indian Ocean World, 1500 through present, Methods and Challenges webinar. My name is Deepthi Murali, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, RRCHNM for short, at the George Mason University. This webinar was actually born out of a need for a nuanced methodological handbook, if you will, one which I don't think Routledge has actually published. So that is where this thought for this webinar came from. And Dr. Nancy who we'll be hearing from today, is sort of like the guiding fairy behind this webinar. So I'm really glad that we're going to hear from her today. The IOW, the Indian Ocean world, sometimes feels like a big pond that separates people, but also creates bridges. There's a spillhouse map that Nancy will actually show us later on, which kind of illustrates this very beautifully. The connections between these regions, the transferability of knowledge and transmutability of the ideas and cultures is perhaps most visible in the material culture of these littoral societies. This webinar is about unpacking those connections and drawing across space and time the translatory potential of material objects and architecture. Simultaneously, it is also about the significance of material objects in everyday lives and the embodied use and emotional connections between people and the things that they make, use, and live in over the course of many centuries. We've chosen to concentrate the series in the post-1500 period, for my own selfish interests, as someone who specializes in the 18th and 19th century transcultural objects and artistic practices, but more importantly, because the European incursion into the Indian Ocean world is undeniably a pivotal point in the region, even as older networks continue to exist and thrive in many different ways. We also found it important to think of the objects that we discuss as contemporary beings with contemporary lives. So some of our speakers will talk about their current lives as lived-in homes, like Pedro Pombo will, or as museum exhibits, as Urmila Mohan, our final speaker of the series, will. IOW material histories are also actually incredibly difficult to study because of linguistic, cultural, and as 2020 has really showed us, geographic and then financial barriers, but also because of intellectual and preservational neglect. These objects present themselves not at crossroads between disciplines, but largely at their margins. So this work in many ways happens outside disciplinary boundaries. And so that's another thing that we want to highlight in this webinar. And quite simply, IOW and other transoceanic regions, as our other speaker, Meha Priyadarshini, is going to talk about today, it actually works through collaborative connections. And I hope this webinar provides a space for us to think about collaborative work and the value of it as we look at these different projects. We're going to talk about collaboration and interdisciplinarity today. And again, when we hear from Carrie Anderson and Marcely Kehoe on April 15th, with April 8th, with their work on digital art history of visualizing the circulation of South Asian textiles through the Dutch East India and Dutch West India companies, which is great. So I hope you all can join us for that as well. We're also going to talk about textiles more with Sarah Feastock on South Asian textiles and their use as fashionable clothing in Africa. A seminar is usually about the end product of a scholar's work, and most seminars don't really give out the details of how that work is actually done. So in this webinar, I hope with the tail end of our webinar is called Methods and Challenges, because I want our scholars, our speakers, to actually bring their research methods and experiences and demystify sort of the idea of how to do such transcultural, transoceanic, interdisciplinary studies, so that graduate students and early career scholars who are interested in these topics can get something out of it. The series runs from March 24th today to April 22nd. And except for the talk today, all the other talks are on Thursdays at 12 p.m. EST. And I hope you join us for all of them. And hopefully we can create a community here to continue these conversations. To that end, we also are going to have a space on our website, www.iowmaterialhistorieswebinar.org, where you can post short reflection or review essays for the talk related to the talks, or if you're compelled to share your own views about the different topics discussed, we are very happy to have collaborators, so please let me know. If you prefer to do this in a slightly shorter version, you can use hashtag IOW Material Histories on Twitter and join us for a conversation there. I'll put that hashtag into the chat box as soon as I'm done. So without further ado, I'm going to just introduce not the speakers, but the topic for today, and then the speakers are going to introduce themselves. So our first talk today is titled 4 Objects on the Practice of Trans-Oceanic Material Culture Studies. In this conversation, Nancy an art historian, and Meha Priyadarshini, a historian, will offer 4 objects as salient entry points into early modern oceanic material culture from the perspectives of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. These objects were transported upon the seas, inspired by transoceanic engagements, or brought up from the depths of the water. Nancy and Meha will be presenting frameworks for treating maritime things, while also suggesting how historians and art historians can inform each other's approaches to mobility and material culture studies. Thank you all for being here, and take it away, Nancy and Meha.
Hey, thank you so much, Dipti, for kicking this off and for organizing this terrific webinar series, which we are very pleased to launch. But I also want to thank you, Dipti, for giving Meha and me a bit of room to deploy a different format than the standard academic lecture. So what we're going to do today is going to be a little bit experimental. We hope to engage in something a bit looser, more dialogic, and ideally possibly social, or at least as social as this particular platform will allow. And along those lines, I'd like to also acknowledge Dan Howlett, who is expertly managing all of these details behind the scenes. So we would like to make this webinar a conversation. And it will be a conversation certainly between Meha and me and Dipti, but we also hope to bring in the audience, all of you, as much as possible. And in that spirit, we are going to start with an introduction, and I'm going to introduce my very dear friend and colleague, Meha Priyadarshini, who is a lecturer in history at the University of Edinburgh. Meha completed her doctorate at Columbia in 2014, and then she went on to hold a string of prestigious international appointments, including a predoctoral fellowship at the Getty Research Institute, a Max Weber Fellowship at the European University Institute in Florence, a postdoctoral fellowship at the Kunsthistorische Institute, also in Florence, and then a teaching fellowship at Sciences Po in Paris. And I'd also like to add that I was very lucky to meet Meha when we were both scholars in residence at the Getty, and since then she's just had a great impact on my work, which I hope to unfold and discuss as I move through some of the objects that I'll be sharing with you. In her work, she explores transoceanic trade through objects. She takes a unique approach to 17th and 18th century Chinese porcelain that is showcased the most vividly in her recent book entitled Chinese Porcelain in Colonial Mexico, The Material World of an Early Modern Trade, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. And in this book, she followed the cycle of blue and white Chinese porcelain from its making in the city of Jingdezhen, then following its export through southern Chinese channels to Manila. She then pursued their export along maritime journeys across the Pacific on the galleon routes all the way to the New World. Her study is an inventive one that conceives of porcelain wares through their entire life cycle, moving beyond those familiar paradigms of Chinese porcelain that are grounded either in localized histories of production or much more far-flung histories of circulation. She brings those two realms together very effectively, while also offering a heightened sense of their material conditions at each stage. And I would just add that Meha is also the co-editor with Nina Capistrano-Baker of a book entitled Trans-Pacific Engagements, Trade, Translation, and Visual Culture of Entangled Empires. And so I pass it on to you now, Meha.
Meha, you're on mute. Sorry.
Oh my gosh, classic. Great way to get started. I want to, before I actually was thanking you, Dipti, before I introduce Nancy for inviting me to this. And it's preparing for this has been actually a really good experience because I'm on leave but going back to work, and it's been a good way to get back into work. So now to introduce Nancy. I've been, in some ways, this has been the hardest part for me of this because there's so much I want to say about Nancy, and I'm actually not going to talk about sort of list her many accomplishments, partly because it's hard to categorize them. And just this morning, I sort of realized it's because Nancy is a polymath, right? Like that you can't put her in one box. She has this incredible ability to learn from distinct bodies of knowledge and put them to really good effect in her own scholarship. So yes, you could say she is an art historian who works on the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean, but if you actually read her work, you realize that she's actually so much more. So just to give you some examples. So when you read her treatment of the ceremonies that happened in Yemen when merchants arrived with their wares, you see that she can actually be an anthropologist because she brings these ceremonies to life for her readers and shows their significance for the various actors involved. And she does this despite the fact that a lot of the eyewitness accounts that she's working with actually diminish them, right? So there's a lot of careful dealing with the archival record that she does that allows her to bring these ceremonies to our attention in a novel way. And the way that she deals with the textual record also makes her an amazing historian. And this becomes apparent when she uses documents to argue that we should move away from seeing wooden furniture that was produced in the Indian Ocean as merely luxurious. So in her handling of the textual and material sources, the ornate chairs and desks proved to be tools that allowed East India companies to produce commercial documentation that would help them maintain their extensive empires, right? They're not just pretty things. And I think that's a really good a reminder to those of us who work with material culture. She's also an architectural historian, as we know from her first book, The Merchant Houses of Mocha, where again, she deftly uses a wide variety of sources to recreate the urban environment of Mocha. Now, in addition to being interdisciplinary, Nancy also reads widely beyond the particular regions she works on. So she has read historians of Japan or of colonial Latin America. And as she says, she really learns from what they're doing and then again uses it in her own work. And I know so few people who read so widely. And then most recently, she has also decided that she wants to learn about using digital tools for her work. So the learning just never stops. And you're going to see some of that in the presentation today. So while she has set the bar really high for the rest of us, she's also an exceptional role model. And I want to end my introduction on a small personal note because you don't get many chances to do this sort of thing. So Nancy already mentioned that we met at the Getty. That was, of course, an incredible opportunity. But being there with Nancy was actually its own sort of privilege. And I will just tell you one way in which she helped me, but there were so many others. I had to do my Getty presentation, which was just very nerve-wracking, and Nancy offered to help me rehearse it. And I have this very good memory of sitting in a room with her and going over it and her giving me this amazing feedback. And I still have some of the lines that she said and some of the questions she said in my head. And I actually now use them with my own PhD students when I'm thinking about helping them think about how to frame their work. So as you might imagine, it's kind of a big deal for me to have this conversation with her, and a great privilege. And so without further ado, I guess we should have that conversation now.
Thank you so much, Meha. That's so kind. I'm really pleased to be here with you as well. I wish we were really actually in the same place, but we're just going to have to live with doing it this way. So let's start talking then about our objects. So we decided on a format in which the two of us are going to offer all of you as an audience 4 things that we think will serve as useful exemplars to consider the intersections between material culture studies and approaches to the early modern oceanic past. In the interest of time, we are going to be keeping our discussions pretty short. We're going to try to stick to 8 minutes. And we are also trying to be quite economical in terms of our use of slides. So we're just going to have 1 slide per object. But because we feel like there's a lot that we're going to take up here, we produced a companion to the presentation, which is an interactive map. And maybe if Dipti could drop this link into the chat, what we suggest is that you might want to minimize your browser window for Zoom and perhaps click onto this link in the chat and open up your browser to another window rather, to just navigate this map, which we think serves as a nice counterpart to the objects that we will be presenting. We also very much encourage you to use the chat if you want to get involved in our discussion. I don't know if Meha and I will be able to really participate with you there until we're done with our planned presentation, but we encourage you to talk to each other as well. So let's get started then. And in the fashion of oscillation, we're just going to pass the baton back and forth. And I'm going to begin with my first object, which is a piece that I have been very captivated by now for many years and have presented on several times, but I think it's a really apt way to begin our discussion today. I'm just going to set the stage for this object. Around the year 1725, a boat set off from Canton, China, Guangzhou, heading, we believe, for the port of Batavia, the capital of the Dutch seaboard empire, now Jakarta in Indonesia. When the vessel reached the southernmost point of Vietnam, it caught fire, and the extreme heat that was generated from that fire permanently fused together some of the items on board and even melted some of the other ones. And as you can see in the slide, these porcelain cups became fixed in the stacked configuration that they were packed in. And indeed, we know that merchants of porcelain very much like to trade in 3-dimensional objects like cups and smaller bowls because they could be nested one within the other, which allowed for maximum space efficiency and, of course, maximum profit as well. We believe that they were then wrapped in either rice straw or paper and then placed within wooden barrels to be shipped. And you can imagine that the close proximity of these highly combustible items near these porcelain cups contributed to their fusion. Then all of this sunk to the bottom of the South China Sea, and then they became part of a new marine environment. Over the course of over 2 centuries underwater, coral grew on the surface of this amalgamation, and shells also adhered to it, and it thus came to constitute a new sculptural form. I would like to note that this type of brown glazed porcelain, which is often referred to as Batavia ware, is distinct from the much more common blue and white wares that I'm sure you're familiar about and that I know Meha is going to talk about in just a few moments. And it is not just that their palette differs, but please look closely as well at the surface texture. These cups are rougher in their texture and matte actually. And you can imagine that this rougher surface would have been more susceptible to marine accretions than those that were covered with a more lustrous and transparent glaze. In fact, archaeologists who have excavated these types of wares from other sites have described them as being very difficult to clean for that reason. In the late 1990s, this boat's cargo, which consisted largely of porcelain, was recovered from the depths of the South China Sea. And today we call it the Kamau Shipwreck. It is named after the Vietnamese city that is closest to it on land, although the wreck is located about 90 miles offshore. But we do presume that the vessel had been piloted by a Chinese crew, and that's because of some of the other finds that appeared in the excavation. And we also believe that it was owned by one of the Chinese merchants of Canton. And so I hope you now understand this object better and that you agree with me that it is a visually fascinating object. I'd like to now bring up some of the critical concerns around it. So obviously, first of all, we're dealing with a shipwreck context. And here is a moment where I'm just going to refer back to Meha and her example, because she really was the first person who encouraged me to take a closer look at underwater sites to understand the maritime culture of trade. And that might seem to be an obvious place to look, but I will tell you, I am very certain that I had not devoted adequate attention to that area. And so those conversations that we had under the bright light of the California sun very much affected me and made me realize a true blind spot in my own work. And so since meeting Meha, I've become much more invested in thinking about these shipwreck sites and trying to understand how to interpret them. And I will say that I offer this object to her as a tribute as well. But shipwrecks are sometimes often, or often rather, erroneously described as time capsules. And that's mainly a way that archaeologists think about them, to set them apart from the landed sites that are defined by stratified layers and thus show change over time. But I'm sure that you will join me in the opinion that clearly the Kamau shipwreck was a site of transformation as much as it was a site of preservation. And there's been a lot of discussion lately about the deep Indian Ocean studies. And the critique is that many of us who deal with the oceanic sphere tend to skim across the surface of the water rather than having the courage to plunge into its depths. And I will say that I'm definitely guilty of that, probably because I'm not a very good swimmer, but also because I generally think about these waterways as transit ways. And so I'm very affected by that particular critique. And for me, this object sits at the pivot between those two different ways of dealing with the ocean. It was, of course, a set of items that were conveyed by the water, but then it became visibly, tangibly reshaped by that marine environment. So this particular object allows us to think about oceans in ways that are both deep and wide. And another thing about our sea sculpture that I think is really interesting to think with is that this, of course, sheds light on the idea of Chinese porcelain as cargo. And I know that there are lots of art historians who are with us today. I think most will agree that we're used to seeing porcelain in mainly two different exhibition or display contexts. One is, of course, the museum context, and the other would be the context of the porcelain room, either in a domestic or a palatial sphere. And those two display contexts are really quite different in some ways. Museums tend to singularize precious ceramic objects, whereas porcelain rooms function really on this large-scale aggregation and kind of almost exuberant multiplicity. But both systems of display implicitly valorize those items that made it successfully to their destination points, as well as those that have generally remained intact over the generations. And what I think is really important about this sea sculpture is that it really allows us to think about this failure of intention. And I spent a lot of time recently trying to highlight and underline and turn our focus to the potential precarities of the maritime journey. Obviously, shipwreck was always a potential problem, as was piracy. We know also that these maritime trade systems were extractive and could very much hinge upon violence, right? And so there's a lot of parts of these trade journeys that we always have to keep in focus. My fear sometimes is that we end up taking quite a celebratory approach to the study of early modern maritime trade. I think many of us are in awe of the fact that these items traveled such far distances and reached such far corners of the world. And, again, I'm also very guilty of that kind of perspective. But at the same time, something like the sea sculpture reminds us of those risks and those precarities and that other side of the maritime trade that I believe that we need to keep in focus. And now I will just bring up as a very complex terrain that I'm only going to introduce by way of provocation. And that has to do with the ethical context of an object like this today. And I will say in general that academic archaeologists generally reject the approach that commercial entities take to the excavation of underwater sites, which tend to favor speed over study and expect to profit from the sale of the finds. This particular site was excavated by a Vietnamese commercial salvage firm, although one that had oversight by an academic team. And I will say that this was really kind of spotlighted as a very important endeavor because the whole thing was conducted by local scholars and professionals. And so it was really touted for that reason. And I also have to underline the fact that these particular operations were extremely challenging due to tumultuous weather, very dangerous waters, and of course the perennial problem of potential looting, which any underwater site can be subject to. After salvage operations concluded, Vietnamese museums were given the rights to acquire the pieces that they desired from the recovered items, because of course they were recovered from the territorial waters of Vietnam, although we do as well acknowledge that they were not intended to land in the site. And there remained then from those objects that were excavated 76,000 pieces that were not acquired by these local museums. And just think about, if you want to kind of think about this, of course, as you can see on the slide, this cargo would have consisted of a large number of duplicates. And so you may want to think about how many of the same kind of, porcelain teacup one museum might want to hold. It might be 10, it might be 20, it probably is not, 1,500. And so there's a reason why these museums did not want to take all of these objects. Then these pieces were auctioned off by Sotheby's in the year 2007, which is how the V&A and other collections acquired them. So I'm just drawing your attention to the question of ethics with regard to the excavation of salvaged shipwreck materials, while also just asking us to think about who should own these things that have been brought up from the water. And now I turn it over to Meha for our second object.
So mine is also a ceramic object, and it is actually going to celebrate the connectivity of the early modern period, although I am very sensitive to this idea that we sometimes make too much of that connectivity and don't think enough about who was being connected and how. But at least with this object, I hope I'm going to show a connection that still isn't talked about enough in early modern global history. So this is a chocolate jar, also known as chocolatero in Spanish, and as the name suggests, it would have been used to store cacao beans, but possibly other valuable things as well. Now, this type of pottery is known as talavera poblana because the poblana comes from the city where it was made, which is Puebla in Mexico. And the word talavera comes from Talavera de la Reina in Spain, which was also famous for its ceramics. And the objects that were produced there, and even artisans from Talavera de la Reina in Spain, would have had an influence on the style that was developed in Puebla. And in that map that Nancy has mentioned, you can see these sites. So this object clearly, if you know about the European Maiolica tradition, you can see that it's heavily influenced by that. It's an earthenware ceramic with a tin glaze. And while it's certainly very European in the sense that the technology and the techniques used to make it came from there, it's also very uniquely Mexican. And so now I'm going to turn to thinking about the different influences that we see in the motifs here. First, I'll show you I'll talk about the Chinese influence because the blue and white is clearly Chinese inspired, and then we'll move on to what makes it Mexican. So this object is also borrowing from Chinese ceramics, which would have been present in colonial Mexico. And for those of you who don't know, Chinese ceramics are coming along with a lot of other Asian commodities, are coming directly to colonial Mexico via Manila across the Pacific to Acapulco. This trade starts in 1565. Silver from the mines in colonial Spanish America is taken to Manila, where merchants are waiting for goods to trade with for that silver. And then these goods are taken back and then distributed to other parts of Latin America, and often also sent on, or not often, but sometimes even sent on to Spain. Now, there's lots to be said about this trans-Pacific trade, but for our conversation, I want to point out that this trade is unique in that colonial Mexico was a colony. It was subordinate to the Spanish crown, but the colony had the direct link to Asia. The metropole did not. And so the trade was actually beyond the crown's control in a lot of ways. And in very material terms, it meant that the colonial subjects actually had access to luxury goods from Asia earlier than their counterparts in Spain. So one of the reasons this object is interesting is because it moves us away from that Europe-Asia way of thinking of the early modern world, which is still very prevalent, right? So it forces us to change our orientation. Now, amongst the goods that were brought back from Manila were, of course, Chinese blue and white porcelains, and a particularly popular object was a jar shape that looked a lot like this jar shape. In China, it's known as the guan, and it would have been used to store wine. And then in Mexico, it's adapted to make the chocolatero and adapted for a local use, which is to store cacao beans. And they add the iron lid because in the Chinese version, it would have been a porcelain lid. Now, in addition to the shape of the object, you also, of course, see the blue and white colors being used, but also the decorative scheme of dividing the surface area in 4 sections and having that central motif. That is also being borrowed from Chinese ceramics. Now, I want to take a moment to discuss this particular central motif here. Flora and fauna were common on crackware, which was a popular export ware, and the inspiration to make a bird such as this would have easily come from seeing birds on Chinese porcelains. But this bird with a long feathered tail, which maybe to us is just a bird with a long feathered tail, in the colonial Mexican context is not just any bird. It would have been recognizable as a quetzal, which was local to Mesoamerica, and it was a very important, locally very significant bird. Its feathers were very valuable, and it was thought to represent a Nahua deity, Quetzalcoatl. So the fact that the maker of this object inserts in what is otherwise a European and Chinese influenced object, inserts this very locally significant motif that's not accidental, right? And in so doing makes this object Mexican, or what at that time was a new craft and then later is understood to be Mexican. I chose this object for a couple reasons, or I only have time to give you a couple reasons. First, because it speaks to the importance of the trans-Pacific trade to colonial Mexico. The direct access to Chinese porcelains meant that artisans could derive inspiration from them, and often Chinese designs were thought of as innocent, right, as apolitical, which meant that they were safe to be used and then adapted. So then this motif, which in other contexts could be considered heretical or sort of challenging the Spanish authority, becomes safe, right? But it also means that it survives. The quetzal survives into the colonial period and beyond because artisans have inserted it so cleverly in such objects. And this brings me to another point, which is that the object also speaks to the importance of artisans as creators of cultural identities. I often think that when we focus a lot on objects, we make arguments that sort of, we see them as reflecting the local culture, right? So this is you could just say, oh, this shows local culture of 18th century Mexico. But what I want to argue is that actually this object is making the culture of 18th century Mexico. And in fact, today, Talavera Poblana pottery is one of 14 local products from Mexico that are known as Orgullo de Mexico, which is the pride of Mexico, because they're actually seen as national symbols. And so I will leave it at that.
Okay, thank you so much, Meha, for helping us make the rest of the circumnavigation around the world. So now I'm going to move to my second and final object, which you see here on the screen, which is obviously a wooden chest. And I think it's best to start off with this object and kind of joining it together with some of the ideas that were brought up with the sea sculpture that I shared with you earlier, because the two objects, for me, allow us to delve into an idea that I will simply call conveyance, okay? And I'm using this term conveyance, which is a term that for me is definitely not identical to mobility, although it hinges on mobility. And I use it to really think about the structures, protocols, and material things that facilitated the long distance maritime transit of trade goods. Central to the system are, of course, boxes, barrels, sacks, and chests, some of which I've already talked about, those containers that were meant to carry the items of trade. But what's important to understand is that those items were also commodities in their own right, but they yet were not considered to be trade goods, even if they tended to be exported. And so it's a very interesting, and I would say liminal material condition. And they tend to kind of disappear in some of the trade records. Like, for instance, if you read a trade register that might talk about 500 pounds of clothes that were bought or sold, those clothes and those 500 pounds will be mentioned, but it's not always the case that you hear about the 200 chests that carried them. And so they were so central to the success of the trade, but at the same time, they kind of come in and out of the records. And here is yet again another way in which I intersect with Meha, who's written so eloquently about packing. And of course, for porcelain and the shipping of porcelain and ceramics that she's written about, that's been really important because these items are so fragile. Their packing was extremely significant. And I was really lucky to have been with Meha at the Getty. I know that the book that I was writing at that time, which eventually got published after I left that residence, that would have been a different book had we not had those discussions and had I not read her dissertation, where she took the time to talk about how these items were packed and repacked and stored. And so I'm going to give her a kind of super footnote here. And I will say as well that these kinds of questions, for some of you, they might seem to be perhaps arcane material questions, but I do want to be really clear that they were very much linked to, and they were really central to the economic viability of the trade. So I find them to be major questions, despite the fact that most, I would say, historians, economic historians, have tended not to necessarily trouble these particular issues. So this is some of the reasons why I've had a real long fascination with boxes and chests in the Indian Ocean. But I do want to just highlight one particular, I guess, methodological slippage, which is that all of those utilitarian, mundane things that I just mentioned to you, none of them survive today. And so I often have to use more precious examples, like what you see here on the screen, as a kind of proxy for those utilitarian examples that we do not have. And so this is all really just due to the poor survival rate, but clearly there is just a gap there that I'm not sure how we can address because of what we still have with us. So now let me get into the chest that you're looking at here on the screen. And I'm going to use this chest as representative of a class of chests that were made in and circulated around the Western Indian Ocean by at least the 18th century, but possibly and probably even earlier. But I will also indicate that that most of the exemplars that we have today that are held either in museums or in private homes, those are later. They date to the 19th and 20th centuries. And these chests are generally marked by their consistent shape. They are wider than they are deep. And size, I've given you the range of sizes here on the screen, although most are between 105 and 125 centimeters in width. Although I will say as well, I am aware, obviously, that there are lots of boxes that were circulating around the Indian Ocean that are much smaller than these, but the ones that I'm speaking about are of this larger format. And in terms of material, they were generally made of South or Southeast Asian hardwood, teak or rosewood, but also sometimes shisham. And this is important because these woods needed to be seaworthy. They needed to spend time on boats, and so they had to be durable. In terms of their decorative programs, they were ornamented with programs of brass plaques and also configurations of brass tacks, as you can see here on the screen. I will say that there's also one group that was carved in extremely high relief as well. And if you click around some of the dots around the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent in the interactive map, you will be able to get a look at some other varieties. So these chests can be found in very large numbers in the ports of the Gulf, so namely Oman, Kuwait, and the UAE, but also along the Swahili coast of Africa, mainly Zanzibar, Mombasa, and Lamu. And of course, that's no accident because these two regions were tightly connected together in the period that I'm talking about from the 18th through the 20th centuries. And so we can understand this as a kind of shared zone of circulation. But I do also want to say that I've seen examples of these types of chests also in landed regions that were adjacent to the Western Indian Ocean. And again, I draw your attention to some of the points on the map to just indicate that indeed some of these objects did permeate further inland. So, as I've been talking about these chests, those of you who are listening, who might be familiar with this tradition, may have noticed that I've been using fairly ambiguous terms to describe them geographically. And indeed, they are usually described using other terms that I want to get into. In fact, this is a strategic choice because for me, it is precisely the geography of these items that poses a key critical problem for this body of objects, but also I would say for all oceanic object-based studies. And so here I'm going to pick up on some of the things that Meha was talking about as she was ending on her chocolate jar. So let me get into this with a little bit of detail for this particular case. So generally these chests are described as fitting into 4 different categories, described as Shirazi, like the one on the screen, Surat, Bombay, and Malabar. So you can understand that all of these 4 types are related to places or regions in Iran or in India. Each one of these types is also differentiated by specific visual features that I unfortunately don't have time to get into today, although I will again point you back to the map in which you can see some of these exemplars. I will say though that the Shirazi type is considered to be the oldest of the group and is usually identified based on its relatively thick brass plaques. They become more delicate in the other versions, as well as a relative amount of restraint in the design. And you'll notice how the lid of this object is not very, has some wide open spaces. One other thing you'll note is that this particular type of chest does not sit on a fixed base. And in fact, those feet are detachable. And again, this is a physical, let's say, remnant of its transportability, that it was meant to be used on board, brought into the house. And when it was brought into the house, it was sitting on, it sat on these feet, but it could then be brought back out onto the ship and it could be moved back and forth. And so it would not be attached to those feet that you see. So I've described these 4 types, again, in very basic terms, but I want to just complicate matters by letting you know that in addition to those 4 types, these chests are usually referred to much more generically as Zanzibar chests sometimes, or as Arab chests as well, or sometimes even with more specificity called Kuwait chests. And so you can already see that these are objects that are connected to many locations around the Western Indian Ocean world. And if we dig into the etymology, in Oman, in Arabic, they are referred to as mandus, but in Kiswahili, they are referred to sometimes as sanduku, which comes from the Arabic word sanduk, or the word caixa, which derives from the word box in Portuguese. So what I've done now is I've just thrown out this whole body of references to these chests that are all associated with different geographic locations in the Western Indian Ocean. I've done so without adjudication or judgment, just to make a few points about them. And indeed, this is kind of getting to the questions that Meha was bringing up that have to do with, on one hand, I would say the perennial problem of origins. And without fail, at least once every semester, I get an email from one of my own students or a student from somewhere in the world who tells me that they're writing a thesis about in which they're trying to determine the origin of a particular oceanic Indian Ocean object type or motif, for instance. And inevitably, my response to that student, again, there have been many of them, is to respond with a great deal of skepticism about the power of such foundational narratives, particularly within an ocean that is defined by long histories of circulation, with fragmentary survival rates and indeed uneven documentation. And just as a pattern in my own work, I have moved away from, avoided, and rejected those kinds of developmental models that champion static points of origin to think about vectors of movement. And I will say, in general, I find that particular approach to be a difficult task and possibly even a completely fruitless task. But I want to go beyond this issue of what we could just understand as more general failures of classificatory systems or the limits of origin and developmental models, because I think that there's a different question that has come up to me with these chests that I think can be connected to other oceanic objects as well. And I would love to get responses on this because I'm trying to write something on this and I'm kind of finding some limits in terms of my own personal vocabulary here. What I'm starting to see is rather a highly unstable relationship between geographic place and the oceanic object. And my feeling is that these relationships serve to confound rather than instruct. And that with its very unresolved historic legacy, Indian Ocean material culture does not easily conform and may even complicate some of our basic art historical impulses to link objects to places in the globe in any fixed manner. I think in contrast, I'm going to start I think I want to argue this. You can let me know if I need to step back on this, but I believe these objects are rather defined by uneven, unstable, and possibly even volatile relationships to geographic place, even while these very self-assured place-based monikers are absolutely ubiquitous and enduring. And I do want to bring us back to the leaflet map that I hope you've been looking at and using, and I hope it's been useful for you. I think you'll note that, first of all, for any single object, Meha and I have presented many different points on the globe, and that's just because for both of us, you cannot pin these objects down to a single place. But I think I should also just clarify that for me, even though it might seem like those dots are meant to fix these objects in at least multiple places, I would ask you to think differently about that map. Rather, what I am asking you to do is to ask questions about the relationship of that object to that place. So not, where do we locate this, but rather how do we locate this, thereby bringing into question the signifying potential of geographical assignments in relationship to oceanic objects on the whole. Now, I'll send this one back now to Meha.
Thanks, Nancy. A lot of what you've just brought up is actually going to sort of be repeated in what I'm going to say about my next object. So here we're looking at what I would say is actually two objects. There is a sample from a fabric. So that in itself is an object that has then been put on paper to make a sample for British manufacturers for whom it was intended. And for me, both aspects of this sort of composite object are useful for my next project, in which I'm trying to trace connections actually between the Indian subcontinent and colonial Mexico through textiles. But a big hurdle for this project, unlike the project on ceramics, is that material evidence so far is basically non-existent or very scant. And here, Nancy's work is quite important and especially to see that people manage to make really important arguments and write really eloquently, even in the absence of the thing that you are writing about. So basically, that's kind of what I'm trying to do a material culture studies project where the material doesn't seem to exist. At least what doesn't exist is I can't find Indian cotton textiles in colonial Mexico. So this is why this sample becomes important to me, right? I have to look at existing material sources elsewhere. And for those of you who don't know, Forbes Watson actually cut up textiles that were held in the India Museum to make this 18-volume work. And in this particular example, he has cut up a part of a kerchief. And these sorts of kerchiefs were being traded around the world, including in Mexico. And this sort of striped and checkered fabric is often known in European languages, and you all will probably be familiar with the term Madras Cloth, right? And it's because it was understood to come from a place that was known as Madras. Now, what Madras meant then, what it means today. I mean, Madras doesn't even exist today. There's no city today on the 21st century Indian map that's Madras. That speaks to what Nancy was saying, right? This pinning of objects to places actually is very complicated. And to what extent is that useful, or how could we make the slippages productive is something that I'm interested in. And actually, this is something that Sarah Fee actually also thinks about, and she's going to be speaking later. So for my purposes, I think there were kerchiefs with such patterns being brought into Mexico, but there's no mention of Madras anywhere in Spanish sources. Instead, there are kerchiefs that are named after a different port on the Coromandel coast, Palicat, and so the kerchiefs are known as paliacates. And it's possible that this happens because the paliacates that were initially traded were brought by the Dutch, who actually had a fort in Palicat. Who knows? I might never know the answer to that. If anybody in the audience is familiar with the Mexican paliacate today, it actually looks like what we know of as the bandana, but just to let you know, that's actually a newer design, and that's not what would have been brought to Mexico in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, today, the paliacates are very important in Mexican culture, but their history has not been well documented. This is because examples from the 18th century don't seem to exist. But I can approximate that they look like this because this type of textile was very popular in the Caribbean. And again, on that map that we've been talking about, I've singled out Martinique to show you an example of this type of textile being used there. And we know that through clandestine trade and through the movement of people, such textiles were introduced to colonial Mexican society. But because there are no actual objects, and because we haven't actually probed connections between colonial Mexico and the Indian Ocean, and there's not actually much scholarship even looking at connections between the Caribbean and colonial Mexico, the history of Indian cotton textiles in Mexico is non-existent, and objects such as the paliacate have actually completely been indigenized. The word itself, paliacate, today is given an indigenous etymology by the official Spanish dictionary, and the object has been appropriated as an integral part of New Age indigenous ceremonies. The foreignness of the object is completely forgotten, and which is quite different to the Talavera Poblana ceramics, where the different influences are definitely talked about. And I'm interested in why this happens in the colonial Mexican context. Why does this textile get indigenized to this extent? What is happening that obfuscates its history? And there are several things that are happening in addition to the fact that we just haven't done enough work on this. One of the things that's happening is that the roots of how these objects came into Mexico is not clear. Maybe it came in through Manila and Acapulco, or maybe it came in through the Caribbean and Veracruz. And then, to return to the sample, at some point, it didn't even come from India originally and came from Manchester or Glasgow, where they were imitating Indian cotton textiles. So when in trying to sort of pin this object down, I also have to think about the kinds of people who would have used them, and tracing these people is very difficult. So in some ways, I'm at a point in this project where I'm going to have to use the sort of skills that Nancy has done with so much of her work, become an anthropologist, become sort of fill in gaps from archival sources that are not in Mexico, right? Think about what's happening in the Portuguese Empire, in the French Empire, and the Dutch Empire. And I chose this object precisely to think about the challenges of doing material culture studies when we don't have the physical object. To date, I know of someone who has found maybe 2 chintz skirts in the Mexican context, even though we have archival records that say the Indian textiles were being brought in big quantities. And again, to end with this sort of slippage of terms, Forbes Watson says that this was made in Vettapalam, which is in Andhra Pradesh, and then he also calls it Madras, right? So what do we do with that? Why does it matter? Does it matter to us to know exactly where it's from? I think these sorts of I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit lost and it speaks to the confusion I have with this object. But the term Madras has taken over these sorts of objects, obfuscating layered histories, different roots. And that's the point I want to make with this object, and I will leave it there. Sorry about the confusion.
Thank you so much, Meha. I think we managed to get through our 4 objects, and I think they managed to somehow connect to each other in different ways, even though we covered lots of ground. Now we just want to conclude with a few final remarks. And I will say, I know that there's a lot going on in the chat. I wasn't able to really dig into that yet because my mind can only work on one channel at the same time, and I'm not even bothering to look at Twitter because it's completely kind of like another channel for me. So I just wanted to add a few remarks onto our 4 objects to just say a few words about maps, because we have offered you a companion to this presentation again that I hope you visited, and I don't know, maybe Dipti, you could drop it back in the chat if in case some people missed it. But I do want to say really that something like a map, we kind of put it out because I think you need maps to navigate this kind of discussion, which went into all different corners of the globe and crossed several different bodies of water. But that particular interactive map that we offered you, I'm not sure that it's the right mode of presentation, right? And so we're not necessarily offering it as a mode of representation, but rather as a set of exploratory investigations. A question, again, that I'm throwing out is, how can we tell stories, marshaling evidence and kind of tools that are visual and narrative, but also spatial, right? And so in some ways, through a kind of series of PowerPoint slides, we're telling the story in one way. Through a map, we're telling the story in another way. They all fall short of kind of capturing what we want to convey in many ways. And it's just one little kind of point of technical point. The leaflet map that I produced, it had a default where it wouldn't let me wrap around the Pacific Ocean. It kept on forcing me to wrap around the Atlantic, which I thought was so interesting. And we can understand here how these maps, of course, try to tell us how to tell our stories, right? As much as we're trying to kind of marshal them to be able to make a particular point. And so along those lines, I'm just showing you here this map that I've really been just kind of enamored with and excited by. It's a map that's presented on the Spillhouse projection, which is a connected oceans perspective that I just kind of, it blows my mind in certain ways. And we thought that it would be kind of interesting to just present this as a final slide, to kind of take all of those sites that were mapped on the leaflet map and now put them here on this projection to kind of think about transoceanic engagements in a way that was connected across these bodies of water. And again, I know we're almost at time. So Meha, did you want to add anything or maybe make some closing remarks before we open it up to all these people who've been so patient?
No, I'm ready to hear from. I think in the interest of time, yeah, definitely.
So we want to open up the chat, and so I know there are a couple of questions in the Q&A already, but if you have more questions, please put them in the chat. And then if it's like a really big sort of complex question, as some of our questions already seem to be, I'll just call on you to unmute yourself and speak up. So Dan, if you can also, help them unmute, that'd be great. So one of the things that was actually being discussed in the chat was I think I wrote down Vivek and Romita had this discussion on topographical associations and sort of like thinking about how to imagine these objects in different ways. So Vivek or Romita, if you just want to, you'll do a much better job of articulating that that point than I will. So maybe one of you can.
I'm sure. I was just thinking about the essays in Suzanne Babai's Mercantile Effect volume, as both Nancy and Meha were speaking on the last two objects. And I've just been thinking a lot about how the association with a place association, a topographical association, actually has a lot more affective potential than it does necessarily telling us about its itinerary or its origins. We see this a lot with the way that kalamkari textiles are remade in Italian contexts, for instance, but both the objects spoke to this. And I wonder whether or not you had anything to say about that issue.
I don't know. Nancy, did you?
Yeah. Sure, I can start us off. Yeah, I think I was in that volume. I'm not sure which one you're talking about, but okay. And but I don't think I talked about that in my essay.
You were.
But you can, okay. Yeah, just remind me what book we're talking about. So yeah. And see, now you're making me feel though that I was in that volume, but I didn't read all of the other essays in it. So so that is clearly a failing on my part. It is on my shelf right here. But this issue of the affective kind of resonance of topography. Yeah, absolutely, right. And I think what I'm kind of trying to struggle with, though, is just thinking about what that relationship of object to place is and was in many ways, and understanding that to be really kind of volatile and to be kind of shaped by so many changing factors, and with those particular chests. So I'm kind of working on this piece right now where I've got the chest, I've got a few other items that, had this really amazing kind of set of histories in the Western Indian Ocean in particular. I've written about one of them before, which is the Kiti Cha Enzi, which is the chairs, elevated chairs of power. I think the part that to me is more interesting is, or that has been interesting, is I feel like that confusion that Meha mentioned, I feel like that is really kind of part of that these sites are meant to send us on these dizzying itineraries that are highly unstable, and I will say in some ways I'm also responding to some of my own limitations in that I had always been fighting with those. I kept on trying to go to all those places. So like when it came to the Kiti Cha Enzi, I kept on saying, okay, I want to, let me see. Like, I would go back to the site, go back to the first instance, keep digging back historically. And I think in many ways, this is my way of finally releasing myself from that set of inquiries, and trying to reset what I want place to mean for me. So in some ways, that is my particular project with that question.
Yeah. Could I want to add something to this too, and actually thank you for this comment, because it actually helps me get out of the bind that I'm in, maybe, because with the chocolate jar I shared, you're absolutely right. There's affective value. The Chineseness of that jar mattered, right, to the people who both made it and who bought it. The fact that it showed that that they were connected to China was important. Now with the kerchief, it's a much humbler object. The people who would have used it would not, their sense of the world would not have been the same. And Madras and Palakat, who cares, right? That those places would not have necessarily mattered to the people who would have used these objects. So they added affect in different ways, and which is that's possibly why the word the sort of word gets indigenized the way it does, and its original sort of Indian origin is forgotten.
If I could add just the one thing to this conversation, is that a lot of thinking has happened around this issue in history of science, particularly in history of medieval science. Lorraine Doston has done a lot of work on what place means for objects and their use and how they're perceived. But it's as you were talking about reading outside of our fields and sort of reading beyond, I think that this is one way, one discipline that I think is very important for the Indian Ocean world. So.
And, you know, it just makes me think too, Meha, and so you helped me to kind of articulate what I was, what was kind of in my head as well too, is that I guess what it is that I do want to kind of historicize those perceptions as well, right? And understanding that, you know, I really am actually grounding this question in our now rather than in, say, an earlier moment. And I cannot really propose to understand or even know what some of these objects, how they were referred to, you know, 200, 300 years ago in the 18th century when I you know, which is my main period, but really kind of thinking about that kind of shifting sense of sensibility about the nature of place that was, again, deeply unstable. And, you know, so the questions I've been asking have been focused very much on, in some ways, that like the kind of prying obsessions of the art historian too, you know what I'm saying, and really kind of talking to that particular space. So.
Thank you, Nancy and Meha and Vivek and Ramita for that interesting discussion. I have another question from Anuradha Iyer, which is kind of related. She asked earlier, as you was during your presentation, if there are other frames of experience that you've come across to root, as in R-O-O-T, root, not route, root these histories, perhaps aesthetic or sensible, or something that's non-transactional.
Sorry, could you just repeat that last bit?
So the question is, are there other frames of experience that you have come across to root these histories that are perhaps aesthetic or sensible or non-transactional?
Root as in R-O-O-T and not.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so I'm looking, and so I see that question. I also see one before it, and what I think actually the larger question is, and if Anuradha is still here, she can respond if I've gotten this right or not.
Waiting for a student. She's here, but she's waiting for a student, so she can listen to us, but she can't respond.
Okay. Okay. Well, I do want to say that, I mean, I think what the kind of, what the two questions together are all kind of asking about this obsession with trade as a practice. And, you know, there is a big critique of Indian Ocean studies and oceanic studies that we're so focused on trade that we've often lost other kind of human dimensions of maritime interaction. And I wonder if that's what it seems like is happening here. That's what it seems like the question is kind of all put together. And to kind of move across, move outside of these transactional kind of frames. And I guess what my answer would be, because, you know, again, you are who you are. I'm very committed to studying the maritime long distance trade, and it's been something that has been my frame, you know, and it is one frame of many. But I will say, I also think that we have not. When we think about trade, we often think about it in really limited economic terms, and that's been formatted from the, you know, the legacy of economic history of the earliest and most painful trade histories of the Indian Ocean that are literally pages and pages of charts. And, you know, for me, even when I was a graduate student, I recognized reading some of those histories that, you know, there are economic historians who could tell you how much a piece of cloth cost every single year of the 18th century. But if that historian were wearing a shirt made out of that cloth on his back, would not even be able to recognize that that was what he was wearing, right? And so we get a real sense for this. For me, it's always been the physicality gap. It's been the material gap. It's also been the social gap. And then to me, by extension, the human gap of what, how we treat trade. So I guess I would say, just personally, I'm committed to this trade history. I think I probably always will. But I do think trade itself goes far beyond mere transactionality, right? And so I guess I would just say, if I'm going to keep on working on trade, to think bigger about trade, and that might be the way that I would go in that direction.
Yeah, I am with Nancy in that I'm also committed to thinking about trade beyond this transactional way of thinking about it. And I've also gone back and sort of read the comments, and if I understand the question correctly, this idea of how it's almost like how do we put the people back into the story, because we're talking so much about the objects, and we're of course limited in time here, but at least in my book, part of what I was trying to do was to sort of go against this idea of early modern connectivity and celebrating and talk about how people were disconnected by the connections that were made by European trading empires, right? So not everybody felt so connected. And this was especially true for some artisans in Asia. So I talk about, in the book at least, that this trade that's being celebrated on the one hand for the Chinese artisan is not so great. Is not making him richer in the way it's making merchants richer, and his world is not expanding the way, let's say, it is for artisans on the other side of the Pacific in Mexico. So I do this sort of connected history, connected in comparison, and in that way hope to show that the trade was experienced differently by different groups of people. And with the new project, the idea is to probe this connection with Indian textiles between the Caribbean and colonial Mexico. And the idea is also to think about people who were moving from the Caribbean into colonial Mexico and how they were bringing their tastes for Indian textiles and introducing them to colonial Mexico. But as I sort of tried to show, it's very difficult to do without actual objects.
Thank you, Nancy and Meha. We're going to maybe ask one sort of like largest question, because this came up in multiple comments, chat, and then also in some DMs that I got. So this is broadly about the anthropocentrism that affects all our disciplines. And so the question is, what are the ways in which, when we talk about objects, how can we sort of, what are the methods that you use to decenter anthropocentrism in the fields and sort of look at objects? And I think Ajay Sinha just put up this quote of the agency of the coral. And I thought that was also by Kristen McKnight-Sethi a little bit before. And so if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting kind of thinking about how some of, the kind of natural landscape in which some of these man-made items, right, like porcelain, then became naturalized to, again, purely by accident, right? I mean, this is why I just love that sea sculpture, because I just think it is so evocative in many ways, right? And it's also an object that, of course, embodies this kind of world of transit and helps us to understand the kind of vagaries of the marine environment, right? And so I love that that is an object that is both produced by humans, but also very much shaped by the sea and shaped by these kind of new circumstances that it found itself in. And I think Meha already just pointed to some of the discussions that I think have been really, really interesting. The work of Dorothy Coe lately on Jingdujen, and I'm thinking about the landscape of Jingdujen and, all of, obviously we see the materials that went into porcelain, like clay and glaze and pigments, but we don't see those materials that have been expended and combusted, like all of the trees that fired the kilns that made that a very sooty, polluted, messy city, right? Before they switched over to electric kilns. And so I think there are a lot of ways in which we can kind of get into the landscapes that served as the underpinnings of these systems of production. And again, scholars I think are doing this, right, and kind of bringing us through again, like thinking about production in ways that are fundamental, ways that are natural, ways that are resource based, and particularly when we're thinking about all of the whole business of teak is a really important one, that without teak, we would not have the maritime trade that we did, right? Because it was, I think, the main material that allowed for such robust vessels to be able to traverse the Indian Ocean. And so, yes, I think we could definitely tell the story in those different ways that are really exciting.
If Shivani Sudhas, thank you. And if Shivani Sudhas here, do you want to ask your question, Shivani? I think she's here.
She's saying, could you ask?
But that means we have to find it.
No, don't worry, I have it copy pasted.
Okay, it's right now. Like it's. Will you please save the chat though, Deepti, so that
yes,
we can.
I will. I will save the chat, and I will put all the links in the chat.
That would be great. And I will say, of course, it was our idea to do a more interactive format, but then then you can see that I'm like not able to handle all of the things coming in.
I've got the question copied.
Well, yeah, but it's like my, it's my desire to have this kind of dynamism, but then, in reality, it becomes a little bit overwhelming.
I don't have the context of this question because
okay.
I posted it a while back. So it says, in regard to the ethics of maritime and connected histories, I was wondering if you could comment on the movement of objects alongside the movement of bodies and the politics of seeing these objects today, as they are often separated from the history of labor and slave trade. In the past, scholarship that has focused on the biographies of objects have compared the commoditization of objects to that of humans, which I think requires revision. I'm curious to learn about how you address these histories.
And I would say this is a good Meha question as well, because Meha has done some nice work at thinking about, again, in that whole long history of movement, transit, and packing, who the laborers were at each stage, who worked, who moved things. And so maybe, I don't know, Meha, can I toss that one to you? Or
yeah, and I feel I've partly maybe answered this question, because maybe it was part of that discussion that was going on in the chat earlier. So I think one of the points I try to make is that making a trade network, often we think about the merchants and what they wanted to move from here and there, but we have to think about sort of, and Nancy has done this with the example of the chest, that there was a lot of materiality to the trade that we don't think about, and then a lot of skills, right? So the packing, the making of the chests that you would then use to transport things, and we don't often think about those skills as part of making a trade network. And I think we need to do, so when we think about trade history, we need to do more of that. And something that I didn't know enough about when I was doing the book, but learned about later, was that in Manila, when they were making the galleons, because the galleons eventually of Spanish design, but then were eventually made in Manila, they actually had to rely on local knowledge of the local woods of how to make them, right? So this idea of the Spanish galleon going across the Pacific, well, how Spanish is it at this point? So that it is flying the Spanish flag, and the merchants are part of the Spanish Empire, but the skills and the knowledge that went into making that, it's quite diverse. And we don't often acknowledge that. So that's one way I address, or I have in the past. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do it in the future, but
no, I think your dissertation and book have been very effective in trying to pull those things together. So.
If we don't have any questions, further questions in the chat, then, you know, we're going to wrap it up because I think we are over time. So I'd like to thank Nancy and Meha for taking part in this webinar and for spearheading our efforts. We're going to hang around a little bit to talk to some of our other panelists who are here. And if you are still here, please, we'd all like to say hi to each other since we haven't gotten a chance to do that yet. We are back next week on April 1st with Pedro Pombo, and he's going to talk about architecture in Western India and in East Africa and the sort of the cultures of belonging. And so I hope all of you come back for that talk. We'll be next week. We are on Thursday at 12 p.m. So thank you so much for being here, everyone.
Thank you.